Next item in our agenda, the red tide duration and nitrogen loads on the Caloosahatchee River. Wow, this is an excellent presentation by Dave Tomasko. My goodness, he came all the way from Sarasota. And then Steve Suau. Oh my goodness, yes. Okay, the presentation will share findings from joint research efforts and research publications looking at the intensification factors of harmful blooms. The project examined the relationship between land-based nitrogen loads and red tide events in Southwest Florida. And the connection between is the relative water quality improvement action 1.5, support harmful algae blooms, research and monitoring the measurement to reduce their environmental, social, economic impacts throughout the identification and reduction of anthropogenic influences. Yes. That's a mission, that's a reason. No, you're going to explain all that to us. So take it away, David.
Right. Do I can play?
Yeah, if it's not working, I can just forward for you. Let me know.
Yeah, I don't.
There you go.
There you go.
All right, so before I get started, I want to thank you guys for inviting me. Also, I want to point out it's Brandon Moody's birthday today.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. I wish I was filming that.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, you're welcome. But I wanted to highlight that this is, I'm the lead presenter here, I'm the lead author, but it's very important to note this is not my idea. This actually, Lenny Landau and Steve Swan here.
Yes.
So what I did when I saw their early presentation, like we need to get this in the peer-reviewed literature. We need to have this, get that, kind of like a seal of approval. And so we've gone through lots of different versions of this, but I want to make it very clear. The idea of looking for a relation between nitrogen loads and the duration of red tide did not originate from me. So I'm like the conductor of a very talented orchestra. And that talented orchestra is Miles Medina, who we brought on, because we wanted to have him review the statistical analyses we were doing. Also, he's a great writer. And we brought Jennifer because we wanted to find out about the management of prevention because it's her backyard and it's your backyard. But with that said, red tides are a regional phenomenon. So this, if you guys are going to the National and Coastal Conditions Observatory System to look at red tides, it's important to note that this is satellite imagery. It's not a Florida satellite. It's not a U.S. satellite. It's the European Copernicus satellite. And it's using an algorithm to detect Perennia brevis that's based upon Perennia, a different species in Irish waters. So it's not using the blue-green wavelength fluorescence algorithm. It's using a red-violet algorithm because in coastal waters, with a lot of tannins like what we have, blue-green doesn't work because so much CDOM is absorbed by blue light. So what we have when we try to track red tide blooms, we were basically using European satellite imagery with an Irish researcher's algorithm. And if they decide that they want to focus their efforts somewhere else, we won't have this tool. There's nothing that the U.S. has that right now tracks harmful algal blooms the way the European satellite does. It's just important to know that. Okay. So they use, the algorithm is based upon a different species of Perennia from Irish coastal waters. But nonetheless, there's always a good fit between satellite imagery of this phytoplankton being associated with Perennia. And we know that because we also have people going out and collecting and actually identifying Perennia. But as you know, this is October of 2022. This is just a bit after Ian. And then 6 weeks later, we actually have a continuation of the same red tide, but it has moved to the north and it is intensified. But if you went through day by day by day, you can see that this is a single event that is just moving. This is kind of like an amoeba-like movement here. So one of the things we had is like, how do we track these red tide events since they move around? This is not staying in Charlotte Harbor or Sarasota Bay. It is an event that is moving up the coast with currents, all that sort of thing. So it's not unrealistic to expect that something like that could be associated with something that happened earlier. This is, again, European satellites. This is true color photography from, which one is this one? Oh, Sentinel-2. So this is European true color satellite imagery. We're getting all our information from European satellites, it turns out. So this is European satellite, this is true color. This is what happened right after Ian. So after Ian, we had these plumes of water coming up. Is there any way to dim the lights a little bit?
It'll be part of it. So
Oh, yeah, no worries.
if you're okay being kind of in the dark.
I'm dark cat, so that's good. So it's not, we don't think it's unusual to think that something like this could be associated with something like that happening afterwards. And so here's our premise, and we want to be really careful about our language. Humans don't cause red tide, humans can cause red tides to be worse. As far as I know, there's nothing humans can do that can initiate red tide. And when you see a reference here, I know a lot of the people in this room might be part of the literature. So I'm just giving like what I think are some of the more highly literature associated with it. However, if a red tide is initiated offshore of the Gulf of Mexico, and if for whatever reason that water mass is transported towards the coast, then you think there's a potential for humans to make that red tide worse. So why do we think that? In part, the basis for the anthropogenic link is that because there's been work that's been done at least 10 years that has shown that Perennial brevis doesn't turn up its nose at a nitrogen atom because it came from a sewer treatment plant overflow or a septic tank or an over-fertilized lawn. They use nitrogen regardless of the source. They can use nitrogen from dead fish and fixation from trichodesmium, but also from human anthropogenic nitrogen sources. What seems to have been missing, in my opinion at least, from a lot of the red tide research, kind of imagine applications, is the fact that there's nothing natural about Florida's watershed. We have pollutant loading models for Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, Lebanon Bay that suggest the nitrogen loads are 2 to 4 times higher than they were like either in the early 1900s or maybe in the 1800s. And you might say, well, that's a model. That's based upon, a bunch of assumptions and, spreadsheets of rainfall, runoff, event mean concentrations. But there's paleomineralogical work done by Gene Turner and colleagues in 2006 that showed that the nitrogen in Charlotte Harbor is about 3 times what it was back in the 1850s in the bottom of Charlotte Harbor. So that matches up nicely. So it's pretty safe to say that we are probably loading 2 to 4 times as much nitrogen into our nearshore waters as what occurred 100 years ago. So yes, the Calusa Indians and the conquistadors maybe talked about red tide, but they talked about red tide that reflected the watershed. It is nothing close to what we have right now. So we also know that the Caloosahatchee River, we don't even know exactly how much more nitrogen comes out of the Caloosahatchee River because it has been expanded in size so dramatically, dating back to Hamilton Diston building his canal back in the 1800s. And then the development downstream of that. We also know that there's been a lot of recent work done on the relationship between the intensification of red tide and the Caloosahatchee River, including by Miles. If Miles is listening, a big shout out to him. He made me a lot more comfortable to be able to say the things that we're going to be able to say. So this is our study area. The red dots represent Perennial brevis data collection efforts. There's over 40,000 data collection efforts that are kind of represented here. We went from Sarasota Bay down to Estuary Bay, and I think we cut it off at 83 degrees west longitude, something like that. So the red dots are 40,000 data points. And the circles represent locations where the flow and or the water chemistry was collected at the same site. So we're not using modeled nitrogen loads, we're using measured loads where we have concentrations and flows. Flows are summarized on a daily basis, I think every 15 minutes. So if you have a nutrient concentration, and most of the, not all of it, but most of the data sets for on a monthly time set, you can figure out a daily nitrogen load, whatever day you want to start. It doesn't have to be a monthly basis. And in fact, I can figure out what the nitrogen load is today or tomorrow. Because you've got these. There's a little bit of discrepancy. It's in the paper. Oh yeah, the paper. It's in Florida Scientist, and it's on the Charlotte Harbor, CHAP website. It's also on ours as well. And it goes into a little bit more detail. But we have co-located water quality and flow. And if you have water quality and flow, you have a load. It's just that simple. And so we have Horse Creek, Joshua Creek, Peace River Arcadia gauge, and the S79 structure gauge. And it's important to note that the watershed that goes into all the rest of these gauges is just basically pretty well defined. But the watershed, effective watershed for the Caloosahatchee includes not only from the lake down to the gauge, but everything that comes into the lake, which means you're now talking about a watershed that goes all the way up into Orlando in the Kissimmee Channel Lake. That's our data that we used. All right, so the K brevis data. So there have been earlier studies on Perennial brevis trends over decadal scales. And the concern has always been that the earlier time, in earlier years, there's been not a consistent effort on monitoring And perennial brevis is a function of consistent monitoring and event-based monitoring. It's different than how we normally measure chlorophyll and stuff like that. But over the last 15 years, we've got 40,000 data points. We average around 3,000 data collection efforts per year. The highest was in the 2018, which represents event-based monitoring. The lowest was the COVID year of 2020. So all the people that collected this data, whether it's flow, nutrient chemistry, perennial brevis, as we show in the acknowledgements, we couldn't do this analysis without all that information. So there's no official definition of red tides that we found, so we made up our own. And what we said is we're going to use two thresholds, 100,000 cells per liter and 10,000 cells per liter. The literature suggests that you can have things like respiratory irritation and fish kills at concentrations as low as 5,000, but FWC calls a value of 100,000 high. So we're basically looking at a high threshold of 100,000 cells per liter, but also 10,000, and both of them are like 2 to 20 times higher than the threshold at which you can have respiratory irritation and fish kills. And we're also saying our definition of red tide is anywhere within that area, maximum cell counts higher than this threshold for at least a month. All right, so not that I found it and it was high one day, it has to be a consistent pattern of higher than those two thresholds for at least a month. We had to build in a little buffer because, frankly, weekends are not sampled, but they're not sampled as frequently. So if someone is sampling for perennial brevis and Thursday the boat breaks down, and then you have a weekend and Monday is a holiday, then you miss a bunch of days. And so what we said is we had a buffer built in there. So, for example, if you had exceedances for 20 days in a row, and you had 5 days where you weren't out on the water, or you were out on the water one time, you didn't find it where you were sampling, and then you had 20 more days, we would call that a 45-day event, not two 20-day events separated by 5 days. That built-in buffer becomes important when we look into this in greater detail. So this is the graphical display of what we call the red tide events. There are 12 of them that exceed the 10,000 threshold for at least 30 days, and there's 11 that exceed the 100,000 threshold for at least 30 days. And they're on the log scale here. The two lines represent 100,000 and 10,000 cells per liter. So if you spend a lot of time on the water, this kind of conceptually makes a lot of sense. Remember what it was like in 2013. Remember what it was like in 2017 going into 2019. And remember what it was like in the post-Ian that we just showed you. So these kind of make a lot of sense to me, and they make a lot of sense to a lot of folks run this line. So 12 events that exceeded 10,000, 11 exceeded 100,000. The difference was event number 6, where it exceeded for 30 days the 10,000, but it did not exceed 100,000 for 30 days. So if we summarize it, 11 events, 12 events, pretty similar. The duration averages from about a month to over a year. And there's a pretty similar, kind of like mean value. So 5.5 months versus 6 months. So over the last 15 years, the average red tide event that we've experienced, as we've defined it, has lasted between 5 and 6 months. So it's a long period of time. Some of them have been only a month, some have been more than a year. During those events, 23% of the days had no data collected. Weekends represented 29% of days. So if you take 2 divided by 7, it's 29%. So what that means is there was sampling on the weekends. It just wasn't as persistently sampled as we sample it, because that's just the way it is. We're not going to go out and sample Sarasota Bay after Hurricane W Saturday. We're doing it today. All right. So that's the way our data set is. So you have to have that built-in buffer. Otherwise, you're going to basically have too many small events with factory being locked in. All right, now looking at the nutrient and hydraulic loads, and this is the data analysis done by Steve Suau. And so on these, you'll notice a pretty similar pattern. The top is the hydraulic load, and the bottom is the nitrogen load. And notice how similar these match up to each other. Red is Caloosahatchee River, and we'll talk about the summary of these events in just a moment. But you see the similarity in it, and you see a couple of things. 2007, very dry. In 2013, I don't think there was a tropical storm where it was very wet season in 2013. The biggest event we have here is not Ian, it's Irma. The biggest discharges we had was Hurricane Irma, but not Hurricane Ian. But the second biggest was Hurricane Ian discharges. So summarizing those, prolonged drought, very wet season, 2 hurricanes, the nitrogen loads and hydraulic loads are pretty well correlated. And the Caloosahatchee River accounts for about 54% of the hydraulic load and the nitrogen load. So the Caloosahatchee River is more than half of the total load as we've measured it in these locations. So now let's look at the relationship between loads and event durations. So the nitrogen loads and the hydraulic loads were both viewed as potential explanatory variables, and the red tide duration was looked at as potential response variable. So we're looking at this not as a blind correlation, because there's no way the logic works the other way around, but is there a correlation between the nitrogen load and the duration of red tides? So we've got 11 of these events. So what we did is like, here's the date when we first start getting higher than 100,000 cells per liter. So we looked at 30 days before that, and then we looked at 30 days after that. Regardless of the event duration, we always kept the nitrogen load across all the events to 60-day period, right? If you did loads during the event against the duration of the event, you'd find a higher R squared, it'd be like 0.99, because you could make a correlation between red tide duration and phone calls to Domino's if you have days on the same side of the equation. But we're not. It's always 60 days against the duration of the red tide event. And the hypothesis was that the nitrogen load delivered as the early part of the event would have an outsized influence on how long that event would last. So what happens before that red tide first starts, how it's loaded with nutrients, and the first month we thought would explain a lot of the duration of the red tide. So let's see if that works. So I'm going to go over, this is the nitrogen load, the next one will be hydraulic load. So the top row is the 100,000 cell threshold, the bottom row is the 10,000 cell threshold. They're about the same, so I'm just going to focus on the top one. The column on the left is all 5 river basins. On the x-axis is the nitrogen load for the 60 days compared to the duration of the event of those 11 events. And the R squared 0.375, I think, and it's significant at less than 0.05. The second column, the one in the middle, is the Caloosahatchee River alone. And the Caloosahatchee River alone, when we look at that, the R squared doubles, and the p-value drops to less than 0.001. So the way you can interpret that is that 77% of the duration of red tides, as defined above, is explained by the nitrogen load coming out of the Caloosahatchee River in that first 60-day period. If we look at the 5 river systems subtracting Caloosahatchee River, it falls apart. So the 5 river system seems to be driven by the Caloosahatchee, because if you take Caloosahatchee out, it falls apart, and the Caloosahatchee alone is double the R squared value, and it's a much lower probability due to chance alone. So the Caloosahatchee seems to be driving the duration of red tide events, as we've explained. Same thing happens with hydraulic loads, and this is actually really important because hydraulic loads have a similar pattern across the 3 different scenarios we looked at, all rivers combined, Caloosahatchee load, and the rivers without Caloosahatchee. So the R squared values are almost identical, which means hydraulic loads and nitrogen loads have equal explanatory capacity, which is, so basically red tide events are initiated offshore. If they're initiated offshore, if they're transported close to the shore, then anthropogenic nitrogen loads can increase their longevity. The overall pattern seems to be driven by the Caloosahatchee River. It could be that the pieces of macro are important at scales other than what we've looked at. So we don't want to say they're not important. It could be that other time scales, other geographic areas that could be important. It's consistent with the findings of Medina et al. But beneath this gives us an equation. So this is something you can plug in. What if you met the TMDL for the Caloosahatchee River? What could you do for the duration of the average red tide? We can put different projects into this equation. We'll talk about the benefits of a reduced longevity of red tides with different nitrogen management scenarios. And this is what we think is missing from the earlier work. Now we have a management endpoint that we can shoot for. Let's knock these red tides back from an average 5.5 to 6 months, knock them back to 3 months. What would it take to do that? We can come up with this kind of equations. So the excessive TN loads reflect excessive hydraulic loads. And this can't be fixed the way we're fixing our water quality problems with Sarasota Bay. We're a small system. We're much better water quality than we had a couple of years ago by going after the wastewater treatment plant and stormwater retrofit. This is a hydrology problem. So the implications of what we need to do should be better answered by hydrologists. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve Suau.
Dave, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, we're not.
Yeah.
When you talk about loads from Caloosahatchee, are you talking about discharges that are empty lots, you're talking about the watershed?
That's 79. Yeah, what comes that?
Okay, so because there's a lot of nutrients coming in.
Come down south, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so to kind of clarify too, Lenny Landau, who really kind of came up with this, he's been looking at this as a retired engineer, pro bono, his own time, and he's here this afternoon, and I really give him a lot of credit. But we looked at nitrogen and load because there's data available, and one of the things that's important is just what if somebody had come to me 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago as a hydrologist, I've been working in Southwest Florida for 40 years, and suggested that the Caloosahatchee River affected red tide up in Sarasota, as far north as Sarasota, I would have been very skeptical. I looked at the data, and that's what all this is based upon. It is the load coming from Caloosahatchee, which is including the Lake Okeechobee discharges that come to the West Coast, is overwhelming. It is probably just as much as all the other watersheds combined. And when you look at the Sarasota Bay watershed, the load is so insignificant compared to the Myakka River, and that's much smaller than the Peace River system. Caloosahatchee and Lake Okeechobee is even more than that, and so it's almost as much as all the rest of the watershed combined. It's almost doubling the loading of nitrogen into the Gulf of Mexico, and it doesn't go through some big estuary embayment that's competing for nitrogen. It's more of a fire hose to the Gulf of Mexico. So the data was really significant in showing how much is really coming out of that system. And one of the other things that I've done as a hydrologist and looking at nutrient loads is looking at the unit nutrient load, the pounds of nitrogen per unit acre. The same for dissolving organic nitrogen or phosphorus as a basis of comparison. And the unique thing here is that because you've got all of that nitrogen being loaded into the Caloosahatchee from another watershed, it's 2 or 3 times the amount of unit load that's coming out of that. So it's very, very disproportionate. And so it's I never thought up in Sarasota that, the Everglades is a huge problem, the management of Lake Okeechobee, but we always kind of thought of it as, well, that's somebody else's problem. I think we have a vested interest that far north, and we probably need to be looking at the same kind of policies that they're looking at on the East Coast to try and minimize the discharges to the West Coast when it's going to have an impact on red tide. And so we've made it very complicated, but it's really not that complicated to restore the Everglades. At the end of the day, I think they'll do it, but from the standpoint of the West Coast, we tried to stay away from kind of coming up with solutions. We just wanted to stay on what is the data telling us. But like Dave said, meeting the TMDL should be the minimum thing that's done. But we probably need more protective policy for the West Coast of Florida from these discharges from Lake Okeechobee. Next slide. Yeah, I mean, that's what's happening. It's people. I think a lot of people. Well, down in this part of the state, they know what's happening, I think, but up further north, I don't think we have. Next slide. And so that's really the discussion is, what are those more protective policies in terms of protecting the Gulf of Mexico from these discharges? And like Dave said, this is not so much a concentration issue. It's a loading issue. It's a mass issue. It's a volume issue. We're just getting way more, and the Gulf of Mexico is getting way more pounds of nitrogen than it did historically from these discharges. So I think that's pretty much where we'll end it then. Yes, Jennifer?
Can I add a couple thoughts?
Yes, please.
All right, okay. The CH&EP has always had a seat on something called the Science Coordination Group of the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Task Force, which is basically the Everglades Restoration Interagency Team. And we sit on that scientific advisory board to bring information like this that can inform restoration efforts, that has management implications. I know you all mentioned about the C43, not the C43, the Caloosahatchee TMDL being met, although that, regulatorily, there's still a basin management action plan that has not been met and fulfilled to recover the river. And again, looking at that's just a segment, like the TMDLs for the Caloosahatchee are handled. There's a freshwater TMDL, there's a tidal TMDL, and there's also a Lake O TMDL. And so, which is not being met. So it really takes all of those being met to actually control nitrogen at a level that would meet seagrass light targets in the Caloosahatchee Estuary. And in C43 reservoir, which is the biggest, CERT project we have going on to address high flows from the Caloosahatchee, storing them, pulsing them back during the dry season, there was a lot of concern about water quality and a lot of discussion about what type of water quality goals should that, we don't want the reservoir to make things worse water quality wise. It was really designed around flow management, but it also, of course, could be a problem if you sit there and put this very nutrient laden water in a storage cell for months on end, that it could grow algae and then re-release it. And we already have significant algae problems in Lake O, in the river. We certainly don't want to contribute to that. So there was a long study done. We provided some technical comment into that. The most cost-effective thing they came up with as the outgrowth of their analysis of different water treatment was an alum injection. So basically taking the reservoir water and trying to use alum to precipitate out nutrients, and that was decided to be the preferred alternative over things like a stormwater treatment area, which the C43 is the West Coast reservoir, but there's a C44 on the St. Lucie, and the C44 has a stormwater treatment area. There were people at the time suggesting that the C43 should also have a stormwater treatment area, but that was not selected. But I think that what all this to say that this work kind of highlights that a hold the line strategy of just creating treatment that wouldn't worsen things is not probably where we need to be with management of that system with regards to water quality. And the recovery strategy, again, is without getting too far in the weeds. I mean, there's lots of assumptions in there too, that, people question, and there's also watershed contribution, as you mentioned, not just lake contribution. So all this to say that this work is really important because basically it can be used to perhaps reopen that discussion and explore, what opportunities exist. There are district lands immediately in the vicinity that haven't yet been designed for projects and things like that. So I hope to bring this paper, now that it's published, to that group and have a discussion about how this could inform Western Everglades restoration efforts and the management of the Caloosahatchee. And of course, we have a new Lake Okeechobee Service Operating Manual that's coming in play here too. And so it's looking at all these different strategies and figuring out, like you said, Dave, how to quantify and measure, what is that cost benefit? If we do this really expensive STA here, what are we going to get for that? And this gets us a little bit closer to being able to effectively make that argument that some of those investments are needed and that they actually would pay for themselves over time. And so I just wanted to kind of say that's our role in this collective effort of trying to use data that CHAP and its partners have collected all these years, analyze it, get it out to policymakers in a way that hopefully can inform their policy decisions to address the issues that we're facing here.
Jennifer, or like to the rest, there are 30 more slides that he had.
Oh.
That's it.
That was the last one? I see 100 and, oh, that's your slide. Okay, okay.
Yeah, no, this,
Okay, that was it.
sorry, I guess I was being long-winded.
No.
Yeah.
But, you know, go off to the paper and have been involved in this effort.
Yeah, reopening the discussion is the important thing. So you can only get so far with concentration reduction. Right? And it's a volume. The load is also the volume, and it's just overwhelming. And that's the nut that's got to be cracked. Like they're doing on the East Coast. They're been no more successful over there probably, but we're getting now what they're not taking.
Okay, one last thought on that. The C-43 reservoir was designed to meet the minimum flow for the river during the dry season. It was not to address high flow. We know it actually isn't even sized large enough to fully meet the minimum flow. So it's a whole different problem and a whole bunch of extra storage and treatment. And then you add in climate change, and you're probably even talking more storage and treatment on top of that.
And maybe this is a part two of this study question. Understanding who I know is going to be receiving this information in the near future and their roles and their positions and their views and opinions about Lake Okeechobee management and the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. Probably an extension of this, it would be great just to take the revised management strategy that's being proposed through LOSUM, you know, the models that they developed and they ran, and run the same thing through them through those same storm events, because I think the model runs go way back into the 80s, something like that, and rerun those storm events or pull out the discharge changes using the new LOSUM strategy for those past storm events versus loads and see if the story changes a little bit. Also, I'm curious as to how, when this goes in front of a bunch of decision makers that have very conflicting opinions about the current strategy behind the operations manual. That is, we're now reducing, in theory, what's going to happen is, unless things have changed in the last few months, and I'm mistaken, the frequency of, quote, damaging from a salinity perspective discharges coming from S79 are going to be reduced because they're going to hold more water in, take advantage of that increased capacity within the lake to allow elevations to go higher than they usually do at the expense of the ecology of Lake Okeechobee and the littoral zone. But when they do release flows, they're going to be fairly high in volume with this rationale that the estuary can recover quicker if you do short bursts of really high damaging loads versus long extended periods of low damaging loads. And so if those storm events are basically high discharge events that can allow for a large push of water quicker out into the Gulf, and that is helping to spur the red tide events, right? So given that there's also this headbutting between, you know, the Okeechobee interests and the St. Lucie interests and our interests, and they come to you and they say, okay, well, what should we be doing differently then? What's the answer?
So
how do we?
I've started to look at this issue because, and it's really not storm events. You're talking about 30 to 60 day load window. Okay. But that always, the red tide events typically as Lenny has taught me, they pretty much start in August, September. That covers probably 50 to 60, maybe 70% of when the red tide events, at least within this period of record, started.
Right.
And so if you wanted to capture 100 of them, you're talking about a window that's maybe from June to November, where where those are the times a year where the discharges are really going to play into this red tide issue. Other times, it's not an issue. And those are probably the times where the minimum flow would apply. So that's exactly what needs to be looked at, what you're talking about. And when does the estuary need the water and when is it causing the most damage? And I don't think they're going to conflict from the estuary standpoint, looking at it, but you've got the other interests with Lake Okeechobee and the eastern discharges that come into play too.
Yeah, because the danger can always be with this is that, I'm sorry, is that, I said on the management side, so I always see these and I think these are great how is somebody going to use this for ill or to, push their own particular objectives or whatnot. And so, just kind of thinking about sort of what's the thought process behind messaging and next steps and how we talk to our managers and elected officials about this.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that comes out of here is, the nitrogen load, the hydraulic load and TN loads are identical R-square values. And so it really is, it's a flow issue. And like, Jennifer said, that means you need to work not just below the lake, but in the lake and above the lake. The Kissimmee River watershed, in the private sector, I work in a lot of lakes. The average lake in Central Florida is 4.5 feet lower than it used to be because we've ditched and drained our watershed. So in fact, before they connected the lake to the Caloosahatchee River, they connected all the lakes to the Kissimmee River. And, Juanita Farms Drainage Canal, Peace Creek Drainage Canal, we have drained the middle of Central Florida. And if we don't really start increasing our wet weather storage capacity above the lake, then it's kind of probably going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to fix the problem below the lake. So it needs a much more holistic. And I think the way I look at it is we have an equation now that you can plug in different scenarios and look at the benefit. It's not just the Caloosahatchee River, San Carlos Bay, Pine Island, San Carlos Bay, the benefits from implementing the TMDL. It's also making less intense red tides that cover a smaller area that lasts not as long. To me, this is the link that's been missing in the red tide research and the coastal eutrophication stuff we've been doing. The TMDL for the Caloosahatchee River doesn't say anything about red tide in terms of why they set a target. But if you could say, meet that target with projects, and by the way, this allows you to plug in a project. So rather than just showing up at a ribbon cutting event for something that's big, is it big enough? If it's not big enough, what do you have behind it? And the way I look at it is you can get people excited about red tide in ways you can't about seagrass. So if you can get people excited about the potentials of meeting a TMDL and what it could do for red tide, dude, why aren't we just making that argument? And now I think it's not just now. For the last 4 years, we've been able to make the argument that humans make red tides worse. And believe me, in Sarasota, that's been controversial to say.
I want to let Miles is raising his hand in the.
Oh, he doesn't get to ask a question.
Yeah, we want to hear him. Go ahead, Miles.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Yeah, just I guess Brandon's comments I think are important and reminded me that something I want to share with the group just briefly. A separate project I did, my first project actually since I founded my company last year was with the Everglades Foundation. And what I did was develop basically a machine learning model that takes in a bunch of live data that are available in real time on everything from temperature and discharge and the loop current and different things, and do basically a forecast of what is the maximum red tide category going to be next week and next month. So 1 week out and 4 weeks out. And the intention here was to give a sort of very easy, straightforward prediction or forecast for what to expect in terms of red tide in the very short term that can hopefully help inform these sort of discharge decisions, or and how they'll what kind of red tide conditions to expect if the Army Corps is considering discharges from the lake. So that's in review right now. That's another thing that hopefully should be published by the end of the year. The model itself is operational. We'll probably do a little more work to make it user friendly so that there's a dashboard or something. But I think it's something that could contribute to that more practical sort of management decision making. Yeah. So I just wanted to share that with this group.
And I have one last quick plug. I'm going to take the host prerogative here to say that, number one, we have a fact sheet and I had Dave Tomasko review it as well and give us feedback. And basically CHNP has a fact sheet on our publications. With this publication, you can find this published journal article and you can find a fact sheet that you can use to distribute to policymakers. We put a lot of thought into how to communicate this and what the tone and the message should be. So please feel free to look at that and use that. The Caloosahatchee Lako, on the CHNP Water Atlas, we have a Caloosahatchee Lako tracker, which simultaneously tracks river flows and lake levels against their regulatory LOSUM bands, as well as the ecological max and min levels for both Lake O and the river. So you can actually watch that live and see if you're in and out of the healthy levels for the river and the lake and how that compares against regulatory thresholds. So that's right there on the Water Atlas. Encourage you guys to check it out. And next year, we actually are expanding to create a new Lake O water body page on the Water Atlas. So just lots of things to utilize right now and things that are coming online at chnep.org and the Water Atlas. So thank you.
James Douglas.
Well, yeah, really interesting presentation. Really interesting too about the equal correlation between the hydraulic load and nitrogen. And we're just wondering if that's something that is going to be tricky to communicate or make it a little bit vulnerable there. Like we think it's a nitrogen problem, but the hydraulic load is the biggest influence on the nitrogen problem. But that's a little bit complicated. And I also wonder if there's some way that we could sort of eliminate any alternative hypothesis. Like there's nothing else about a big hydraulic load that might prolong red tides, is there? Does it change? Does it stratify the water or do anything else? Is there any reason that just the hydraulic load in itself might do something and not the nitrogen? Just thinking about, you know, because our two fixes are reducing nitrogen loading into the water and reducing the amount of water coming our way. I think we need to do both of those, but which do we focus on? Just making really, really sure we've got the science right about what the driver is and is going to be important.
I think, like, if you look at like some of the early work by Dean Martin, I know what a name, USF chemistry professor, he talked about the potential of the iron load, and iron being a chelating agent, the tannins being a chelating agent for iron, which would be triggering trichodesmium, which is making nitrogen. The Caloosahatchee River water chemistry is not really way out of whack of the other river systems, but the percentage of the nitrogen that's in inorganic form is about 10 times higher. It's not the majority, but the DIN content of TN in the Caloosahatchee River is higher than that. But, you know, I think one of the things I've heard from other people, and I've presented this, and I've only presented it like twice, was that, well, you know, what about the 1947 red tide? That was the red tide that lasted so long. Everyone blamed the Navy for doing that, you know, post-World War II ammunition. But if you look at the 1947 rainfall record in South Florida, it was 100 inches of rain in South Florida in 1947. So I think what we're doing is we're making red tides. You don't have to have 100 inches of rain to have a year-long red tide because we're actually loading the system. But I think we need to be careful. It's your watershed, not mine. But I think the idea is it's not so polluted. It's not like wastewater that's coming down there. It's the nitrogen load associated with the dramatic water load. And I think if you want to fix the nitrogen loading, you have to fix the hydrology in ways that we don't have that challenge in Sarasota Bay. There's not a wastewater treatment plant that's going to fix this problem. It's a hydrology issue more than anything else, it seems. And that gets to the point. You got to work above the lake and downstream. Like you can't just expect C43 to fix your problems. Percentage-wise, it's just not going to get you the MVL.
Ouch. Yes, sir.
I was curious if deep well injection could assist with the volume.
I got no idea, but I can't imagine we'd be able to do that.
No, they've explored, they've done extensive engineering on aquifer storage and recovery wells. And it's just, it way exceeds what you geologically, like they're going to use some scale of it, but it can't even be at the scale they originally thought it could be used because of the porosity of the rock, the fragileness of the limestone. And so anyway, you're creating a lot of pressure that could create fracturing of the geology. And so anyway, that's been deeply explored because that was part of the original CERT plan was to use more underground storage. Unfortunately, there's a limitation to that. So now
You can't get pumps big enough.
that's another issue.
There are some opportunities like Cypress Lake. Cypress Lake is like 2 feet lower than it used to be. And there's not a whole lot of people around there. So look at what SWIFMA did with Lake Hancock lake level modification project. Upper Peace River MFL has been effectively met more than 90% of the time by raising that lake level. And so they've been able to hold water back in the wet season. So I think like this commitment to implementing dispersed wet weather storage throughout the entire watershed is going to cost a lot of money, but look at the benefit. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it'll be worth it. if you can come up with actions that can shorten the duration of red tides by a month or two, dude, who wouldn't want to do that?
Okay, thank you very much.